With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
It's our Tell Show. It's a Monday, folks. So glad you're back with us. We are back home after being on the road for a couple of days. I'm Andrew Donaldson. Thank you so much for joining us. A lot to get to this week. Going to turn down the noise of the news cycle, get back to work. Glad you're with us. Year of our Lord 2022 continues to roll on this April the 25th, and we're going to talk about a couple different things. Ronald Klain, the chief of staff for President Biden, took one look at the French elections and drew a very questionable conclusion. We'll touch on that. Marjorie Taylor Greene down in Georgia, a very problematic congresswoman who we think should be expelled from Congress. Nevertheless, she was on the witness stand. And wouldn't you know it, that really bombastic people, when you get them under oath, tend to change their tune on what they actually say. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Also, in the program, we always try to end on a good note or a happy note. In this case, it is Sean Connery, the late Sean Connery, the great Sean Connery. He had quite an extensive art collection. Turns out he actually had a real-life Picasso going up to auction for charity. Talk about that in just a minute. Our guest today, Gabriel Salazar Singh, another great Young Voices contributor. He's in Costa Rica, where we're going to talk a little Mexico politics. There's some very troubling things going on south of the border of our neighbor down there that we need to talk about. The government there, AMLO, doing some constitutional referendums, expanding power. Is he trying to become a dictator like has gone through so much of Latin America and South America? We'll talk to Gabriel Salazar Singh as our guest today. But first, let's talk about that French election we mentioned just a minute ago. Over in France, there's been a lot of press over here. We've talked about it a couple times on the show. Marine Le Pen taking another crack at trying to become president. She's deemed a far-right candidate for a lot of reasons, not only because of her politics, but also she has some ties with Vladimir Putin. Her political party has some very questionable stuff when it comes to things like race, like nationalism, like national populism. There's some accusations, even though that political party got bank loans from Russia. That well goes really deep. You can look that up in your own time. Needless to say, it would not have been good for anybody in the free world if she had won the election in France. She didn't make it to the runoff. And the way they do it in France is they have a multi-tiered system. So she did a runoff. Well, they had it on Sunday, and President Emmanuel Macron won, and he won convincingly. The polling wound up being about 58% to 41% for Marine Le Pen. Now, this is a pretty wide margin. This was covered as like it was going to be a much tighter race, and like Le Pen was going to have a shot at it. Now, there's a couple things we want to touch on here about this for a few reasons. One is in the Western media, why is it always covered like a horse race? Well, that's their only template for these kind of things. They always want to have a horse race. It's got to be close because otherwise you can't cover it. And Marie Le Pen, the Western media, especially American media, just could not resist trying to tie her to Donald Trump, even though they don't really have any direct ties. It just fits the narrative really well. So they tried really, really hard to make this seem like it was going to be closer than what it actually wound up being. And it ended up being Macron won very, very handily. Now, the other part of this is, what does it mean for France? Well, Marine Le Pen was talking about taking them out of NATO, was talking about maybe even taking them out of the EU. Again, we talked, she has some very questionable ties with Vladimir Putin. This could have been a really ugly thing for France and for the Western order, and for a NATO and an EU that has really come together in the last few months in the wake of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, their illegal war, and all the war crimes that Vladimir Putin is putting upon the Ukrainian people. So what happened in France? Well, it's not all good news for Emmanuel Macron. They more voted against Le Pen than they voted for him. He's still going to have a mess on his hands when it comes to governing. They've had a lot of protests in the streets. They've got a lot of issues going on in France, but he did win this election pretty handily. One thing they wanted to point out in a lot of this coverage, France 24, we read from them a little bit earlier. The abstention rate, people that did not vote in France, was 28.2%. That's up 1.9% from the first round and 2.7 points from the second round in 2017, last time they did this. That's a lot of people abstaining by French standards. But then again, when you think about it, that same abstention rate here in America would be one of our highest attended elections. It's just funny how things work out like that. A couple other things to go into. Le Pen, trying to spin this as something else, described her defeat, this is reading from France 24, as, quote, striking victory. Huh? And says she was launching a great battle for the June parliamentary polls. Striking victory, she lost 58 to 41. This is multiple failed attempts to become president, none of which did she get really, really close. Striking victory compared to what? The Scots at Culloden? Pickett at Gettysburg? We kind of make fun of our French friends for retreating and surrendering and things like that, a little unfairly probably, but this is kind of the other end of that spectrum. This is delusional. She's not any closer to victory, thank God, because she's a very highly questionable human being, let alone politician. But she's going to spin this, and they're not going to go away. Le Pen was held up here in the States and elsewhere across the world as part of what they call the global right. More right-wing, very nationalist, very populist, strong ties to very questionable things like Russian propaganda and misinformation. It is good for the entire world that this went down the way it did. It's good that Marie Le Pen lost. It's good that the Fifth Republic still seems to have a little bit of life in it and still wants to be just that, a republic, and not some autocratic dictatorship that bows to the whims of people like Vladimir Putin. We have longstanding ties to France. When our founding fathers sat down to put together the kind of government they wanted us to have, they drew heavily from French philosophy. The French came to our aid. Without their navy, we may not have won the Revolutionary War in the manner we did, and probably not as fast as we did. They've been our friends for a very, very long time. Long may they be our allies. We want to be them. And we've returned the favor a few times over, including helping liberate Paris and the rest of France from the Nazis in World War II. The French and us have a lot of longstanding ties, but one of them that must be most important is freedom and liberty. Now, France has a different system than us. Obviously, their country has a lot more tendencies more towards the European model. They're far to the left of what we would think of as our model. But even still, there still seems to be some sensibility left in France. And it's a good thing Marie Le Pen went down. Otherwise, freedom would have went down in short order right after her. More Hertel right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Still talking about this French election for just a second. Ronald Klain, he is the chief of staff for President Biden. Now, him and Biden have been together for a long time. He served with him when President Biden was the vice president. So he's been around for the block a time or two. We kind of jokingly call him the prime minister because the job of the chief of staff is he's the gatekeeper. He runs everything, but he also controls what does and does not get to the president. It also means everybody underneath him goes through him, good, bad, and different, which makes him both very powerful, but also the target of just about everybody in Washington. It's a tough job. That's why people tend to run through them pretty quickly. But anyway, Ronald Klain has some bad tendencies, and one of them is he likes to get on Twitter, and he's not very good at it. He put out this tweet about the French election, and I'm just going to read it verbatim. This is the official White House chief of staff Twitter handle, by the way. An interesting observation, just FYI. President Macron appears to have secured a double-digit victory over Le Pen at a time when his approval rating is 36%. And he is quote tweeting a piece from Morning Consult that talks about those numbers and government leaders and country trajectories in 22 different countries. Oh, Mr. Klain. Okay, let's go through this real slowly using small words for folks like Ron Klain, because he mostly retweets things like Jen Rubin articles that are really, really flowery and complimentary to the president. And just in case anybody from Logan's listening, we don't want to lose them. So let's go slowly, make sure everybody out in overflow hears what's going on. Okay. France's system is different, and things that are different are not the same. France has a multi-tiered, this was a one-on-one election. They don't have things like the Electoral College, and they also have a different system of government. And this is not going to be completely analogous to American politics. Yes, Macron had a very bad approval rating, but approval rating is something that happens in a vacuum. That's where you call people up and you say, hey, do you like the president or not? Yes or no. That's different than an election where you have two people running and you have, do you like this person enough to vote for this other person? That's a whole different story. Case in point, in France, we already talked about the abstention rate was almost 30%, where a bunch of French folks took a look at that hot mess and went, nah, bro, we're good. We're staying home. We had this here in America as well, even with record turnout and a record amount of votes for Joe Biden and for Donald Trump. Both exceeded all previous vote tallies for their parties. There were still over 40 million Americans took one look at that hot mess and go, nah, I'm not having anything to do with this. And they did not vote. That's why approval ratings have a little bit of a limited shelf life when it comes to politics, especially when it comes to projecting out. First of all, we don't know how the midterms are going to go. We're assuming the Republicans have a really good year, maybe a wave year. We'll see how it breaks down. That'll change how President Biden is perceived. Why? Well, because now he's working against a Republican Congress. It's going to change things a little bit. And if he runs in 2024, which we all think he will, unless something catastrophic happens, he'll be running a very different campaign than 2022. He could have very bad approval ratings. And if the Republicans put together somebody who has even worse public approval, he'd still win with those bad approval ratings. Are not votes. Approval ratings are not actual poll data. Approval ratings are something taken in a vacuum. It can be an indicator, but it's not a thermostat. It doesn't set the temperature for an election necessarily. So yes, Ronald Klain, the French president, won with bad approval rating. You may not have a Le Pen for Joe Biden to run against. And you may have a Donald Trump, which may be not all that different, but that's another matter for another day. Just make sure you understand every time we do these kind of analogies, things that are different are not the same. We are not France. We have a different system of government, and he should just focus on his own house, because that bad approval rating, Mr. Klain, has your fingerprints all over it. You should probably see to that, or you may not be in the next administration either which way, even if your boss does win. More Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, let's go not overseas, but just south of the border. One of our neighbors. We're going to talk a little about Mexico, but our guest that's joining us is actually a little further south than that. Costa Rica, one of the real beautiful places in the Western Hemisphere. I got a buddy of mine who lives down there, keeps wanting me to visit. I'm going to have to take him up on that. Gabriel Salazar Singh. We're going from the oldest, youngest voice, which is me, to the youngest voice. Gabriel, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Appreciate your time today. All right. For folks that don't know, you've been writing in International Policy Digest. What's been going on south of the border? Because other than the border stuff and immigration stuff that we talk about in the United States and it gets a lot of play, obviously the stuff with Governor Abbott right now, that's all border policy stuff. But what actually goes on in Mexico doesn't get as much press here. The president down there, AMLO, I'm going to let you pronounce it, not me. That's the abbreviation. There's been some news with him, and you've been writing about just big picture wise, just to set the scene for it. Let people know what the current state of play in Mexican politics in the country is right now with President AMLO.
Yes. So to summarize it quickly, my piece, as you mentioned, published in International Policy Digest, I denounce how Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO for short, has acted in a populist manner to grip much more power than the president already has in Mexican politics. He sought to delegitimize the press, Mexican institutionality, reform the constitution to his favor. He has revealed a journalist's salary on a presidential conference and called for a nonsensical referendum on whether or not he should remain in power for longer, which in my opinion will only help polarize Mexico, even though it already happened. I think that the effects, we will not see them until the 2024 elections.
Now, when he originally ran, He ran on an anti-corruption platform. He was, it's a different kind of populism because obviously there's cultural differences and the system of government's different, but you could say it was a populist campaign. He was big on the anti-corruption. We know the issues, long before him, issues in Mexico. Corruptions, of course, are always dealing with criminal elements, these sorts of things. And it's kind of a, how would you describe, let's just pull up and park here for a second because it's important for people to understand the Mexican style of government that they have right now. How would you explain it to an American audience that's used to our, pretty strong federal system where the states have a lot of power, the federal government has a lot of power, and there's conflict there? Decentralized is kind of the wrong term, but it is kind of a unique system. Just explain the system of government for just a minute so that we have a base of understanding of what these things that he's doing means.
Yes, so as you mentioned before, Mexico has a federalized system of government. They, of course, have the office of the president. They have a legislative body, which is composed, or it's a cameral legislative body of government. They have the Senate and the lower chamber of Congress. They have a judicial system, which I believe has been a root of most of the troubles in governance in Mexico, because even academics say that the judicial system in Mexico is extremely weak, and constitutional reforms over the years have helped weaken the power of the judicial system.
Now, since those judicial system is various weeks, we see that on the news, unfortunately, with some of the violence and some of those issues. What does the average Mexican think when they go to vote electorally? You talked about the constitutional reform process, but day in and day out, we're doing a midterm cycle, and we understand that sets up our presidential election in 2024. As the Mexican citizen is looking at this, do they see this as, because again, AMLO ran as a non-systemic's the term you use. He ran anti-corruption. He was going to change the system, but it seems like now he's just changing the system to fit his means and his wants. What's the average citizen in Mexico thinking when they go to vote in this particular cycle? Do they have hope, or is it more we're stuck with this and we don't know what else to do and we don't have a better option?
So let me give you some context first. In the article, I mentioned the concept of the perfect dictatorship. It's a concept that a Peruvian author violently denounced in Mexican television back in the 90s. In the beginning of the 90s, I think, where he said that Mexico was the perfect dictatorship, not because it functioned well as a dictatorship and because there was the permanence of power of a single individual, but because there was the permanence of power of a single party, and they disguised it perfectly as a democracy. They, however, penetrated all aspects of Mexican culture, their system. For example, the opposition parties were financed by the main party, the government party, the PRI, which tells you how much of an opposition they were. They used nationalism to polarize people. It was so systematic that even the owner of Televisa, the news channel back then and even now, called himself a proud soldier of El PRI. In the Enrique de la Madrid elections in the 90s, 80s, I don't precisely recall when he was elected, they made sure to cover all of his events, and his opponent wasn't really covered by the press. Now, it wasn't until the election of Felipe Calderon that the PRI lost the elections. Then came another party, El PAN, and those were established as the two main traditional parties in Mexico. Now, as you mentioned before, that corruption is rampant in Mexico. Gang violence through the cartels is extremely high, and the people are obviously tired of that. In the 2018 elections, they demonstrated that by voting in Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, with a 53% of people who voted for him. You said that he ran as a populist, but he has governed as a populist as well. before this referendum asking if he should resign or not from power, he had another referendum asking the citizens whether the ex-presidents, the former presidents still alive, should be taken into trial for corruption or whatever for their actions, which obviously goes against the liberal democracy order of the separation of powers. It's the presidential system or the presidential figure penetrating the judicial system, getting into something that is not in his incumbents to be in. Now, this referendum, the newer one, which was held some days ago, only 20% of the people went to vote, which tells you how apathetic the people are towards voting. 80% didn't want to vote, didn't want to participate in the elections or in the voting of the referendum, which tells you that people are also tired. They are not only tired of the corruption in Mexico, but they have lost a lot of faith. And I think that that's one of the things that starts to erode democracy around the world, not only in Mexico, when people start getting tired of what they have been presented, that they have been manipulated by many governments. And yes, that's basically it to answer your question. I hope I answered it correctly.
No, you did fine. When you wrote in the piece about it, again, we'll be linking to your piece in International Policy Digest. I've had things published there before. You mentioned that they had actually downgraded Democracy Index report. They bumped Mexico down from a flawed democracy, that's their term, to a hybrid regime, labeling Obrador and a liberal populist. We just talked about the populist label and what it means. Because, and this is you writing here, because of his disregard for democratic norms and his continued efforts to concentrate power in the executive branch. Illiberal populist, I think, is a fantastic term, but that hybrid regime term, you mentioned it before. Let's loop back to it for just a second, though. Having the pretense of democracy, having the pretense, he's using the referendum system a lot here. That hybrid regime, I think, is a label that should be applied to this, maybe a little bit more than populism, because populism's the movement to get the political power of the people involved. But the hybrid regime is kind of the nuts and bolts of this, is like, hey, we're going to use the democratic process to become authoritative. It's just the last vote is going to be to make us authoritative for life. That hybrid regime seems like a really good way of explaining that, and that's a great term for it. Yes,
I agree. I think that it's highly... It's worrying that an institution as serious as The Economist and their index has labeled the Mexican democracy going down. And you've got to see all aspects of government and how AMLO has penetrated them. The Supreme Court president is in favor of him, or has been said to be in favor of him. He controls both chambers of Congress and many democracies in Latin America. So we know about the separation of power between the three branches, the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. But many countries in Latin America, we could consider that the fourth power of government is their electoral institution. I think that it's worrying that AMLO wants to have constitutional reforms be made to change their electoral institution. For example, they want to. So think of it like this: in a perfect democracy, you'd rather have technical people running a central bank. You'd rather have technical people running the electoral institution. But one of the reforms AMLO wants to make is that the people elect those who are in charge of the electoral institution. And he says, each branch of government should propose 20 candidates so that the people have 80 candidates they can choose from. Now, look at it this way. We mentioned the apathy towards voting. Only 20% voted in this referendum, which means that only those who really support him have participated in the country's elections. And imagine it this way. I'm not sure if you agree with Mr. Trump's proposals and what he has said after January 6th, but imagine if the United States elections we're polarized that way, so that the people elect those who are in charge of vying that they are free and fair elections, and that some people run with the idea of turning the elections towards Donald Trump. This is one of the main problems it presents. Institutions like this shouldn't be polarized. Never, under any circumstance, should the central bank be polarized or politicized. And same goes for autonomous institutions such as the Electoral Institute.
Yeah, we're talking to our friend Gabriel Salazar Singh. He's down in Costa Rica, but we're talking about Mexico, our neighbor to the south or to the north for him. When we come back after the break on Heard Tell, we're going to continue to talk about some of those other institutions like the press, some very alarming things involving the press down south in Mexico. Also going to talk about that apathy a little bit of a disparaging thing there. You only got 20% voting, but AMLO's popularity remains high. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what he calls the anti-systematic platform some more. More with Gabriel Salazar Singh on Heard Tell right after this. Welcome back to Heard Tell, talking to our friend Gabriel Salazar Singh, talking a little bit about Mexico politics, some things going on, some very troubling developments in the current reign of President AMLO. We talked about some of those, non-official institutions in America. We often talk about the press, the free press being an institution. But in Mexico, you already touched on it a little bit. There's been some really disturbing stuff in Mexico. As you listed in your piece, there's been at least 6 prominent German journalists murdered just in this year alone. We had the incident with Obrador. I still think I'm saying that wrong, but AMLO publicly, what we would probably call doxing a prominent journalist, revealing their salary, revealing personal details about them, which everybody took as a pretty direct threat for good reason. What is this situation with the free press in Mexico, and how does that kind of build into the constant corruption and the constant problems with the government that you don't have an accountable press that can get after the government?
So journalism, the press, and every aspect related to it, I think that everyone who lives in a democracy must admire. One can criticize it, one can be against what the journalist has said, but to have the president vehemently attack a journalist by revealing his salary in a country which we know has high criminality rates, high gang violence, in which he knows as president that 6 journalists have been killed, and to reveal his salary on live television, which was a high salary, tells you a lot about his motives. These aren't good motives. He's setting him up for violence, for theft, to being kidnapped. One never knows with the violence that goes up there. And sure, he's not going ahead and using policemen to kill Mr. Loret de Mola, the journalist, but he's certainly using his power to say, oh, maybe go ahead. And he said, I think I mentioned in the article where he said, if you attack me, you know what happens. What can you think about a president who does that, right?
You mentioned in here part of this, it's almost become a stick. I don't know how you would say that in Spanish, but it's part of his public rhetoric now to do those flourishes, the strongman routine. We've seen this with our own people. President Trump does this a lot. It's the wink, wink kind of threatening stuff. It's the strongman stuff that you're alluding to. You mentioned in the piece that he kind of had a moment kind of similar. You compared it to Richard Nixon's "I'm not a crook" moment, but where he stood up and used a very specific term that folks in Mexico knew exactly what he was meaning, didn't he?
Yeah. So he uses the term, or he said, "I'm not a cacique," a chieftain in many Native American tribes, especially there in Mexico. I'm not a dictator. and he said that as a candidate. So I compare it to Richard Nixon's "I'm not a crook" moment, because if you gotta say that as a candidate, it tells you a lot about his rhetoric, his persona, how he's acted, his proposals. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, let me give you another Latin American example for just a second. When he ran for president, I recall seeing an interview with Jorge Ramos, a brilliant journalist who asked him about his dictatorial aspirations. And Hugo Chavez used to say, no, we're going to work closely with the private sector. I believe in the private sector. I'm not a dictator. Dictatorship is what has happened before, even though Venezuela was a democracy when Hugo Chavez was elected president. And so I go back to what I was saying. If a president has to say that, or a candidate rather, has to say that in the midst of a presidential campaign, it tells you that the people are scared, that he isn't trustworthy, and that his proposals, his rhetoric, his persona has been like that of a dictator, especially in a region that has been highly traumatized by the dictatorships that have happened over the years.
Yeah, is that what we're looking here? If you don't get some kind of an electoral defeat for him, at least for his party, if not for him directly, you already mentioned Hugo Chavez. We know that his replacement was as bad, if not worse. There's a long history in Latin America. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Noriegas. Pick whoever you want to. There's a long history of populist strongmen that turned into dictatorships. Is that really, what's the likelihood of that happening in Mexico right now with AMLO? Is that what we're really looking? Are we really one election away from him being a perpetual strongman that is going to be electorally untouchable?
So I believe the permanence of power of a single person, at least, is one of the characteristics of a dictatorship, but not the only one. He could perfectly leave power in the next elections because, well, presidential re-election is not viable under Mexican law. There is no way for immediate re-election. At least I don't really know if there's way for re-election later on. But when has the impediment of presidential re-election been an impediment for dictators around the world? It has never been an impediment. Take a look at the last presidential polls. I've said before that I believe that making electoral calculations from now is highly and incredibly impossible. Context might change. We saw this with the coronavirus pandemic around the world, where elections suddenly gave us unexpected results. But in the last elections, AMLO got a 53% of people who voted for him. The polls show that support has grown to 60%, and that the second place goes to one of the traditional parties who goes just above 10% of the people who support them for the next presidential election. So once again, the permanence of power of a single person is not necessary for a dictatorship to be made, but the modern dictator gets to power through the system and then rigs it to his favor. What if Morena wins again and they go with all of the reforms that they want, having increased their majority in Congress, having penetrated the judicial power, maybe even the Electoral Institute in Mexico, which, apart from AMLO wanting to politicize it, he wants to federalize it, which means taking away the power that the Mexican states have and giving it to the federal government. Andrew, let me ask you this question. If you were the leader of a country in a hypothetical scenario and you wanted to remain in power, what would be the first reform that you would do?
Yeah, you consolidate power and you get a hold of the electoral process.
Exactly. So this is why we have to eye these reforms that AMLO wants to make in Mexico with a close eye. Because Latin America, as we've mentioned it many, many times in this interview, isn't foreign to the concept of a dictatorship. It's so worrying, so sad that the whole region has had this tradition of voting against our interests, the democratic interests. And here's a factor. Let me talk about the militarization of the country that has gone under AMLO. So back in Chile, for example, in the 1970s, Salvador Allende was elected president. He faced lots of opposition. His economy was crumbling. He wanted, or at least I think from an analysis point of view, that he wanted to consolidate power. And what did he do? He gave power to the military. Now, who was one of the people he gave power to? Pinochet, who we know was dictator from 1973 in the coup d'etat that happened in September 11 of 1973 and remained in power until the 1990s. Now, why do I mention this? AMLO has given too much power to the military in Mexico. More than 30 tasks have been given to the military under him that don't necessarily pertain to a military in Mexico and not in normal democracies. Control of ports, the construction of all parts of the Maya train, of banks, the construction, administration of hospitals and airports, and they have even attended crime. They were also the ones who rescued Bolivian dictator Evo Morales after there was electoral fraud in 2019, and the people ousted him out of power through protests, which tells you as well that he has been cozying up to dictators. Costa Rica, my beautiful country. Why do you think that we have such a beautiful democracy in the concert of nations and such a comparable example and some institutions to look up to? Because we have no army. The army doesn't exist. We can invest that money into education and health and the people, but more than that, we have healthy institutions, a healthy separation of power, strong branches, and no army.
Talking to Gabriel Salazar Singh. One last thought to kind of loop back where we started to bring a bow on this conversation. You talked about the people. The people as populists usually put these dictators in power because he tickles their ears and tells them what they want to hear. The only way you usually get rid of a dictator is the people have to rise up and take it back from them. The discouraging thing here, and you noted in your piece, though, is even though the Mexican people are very apathetic in their elections, like you said, they only had 20% turnout this last time out, projected to be that again or close to it. His personal popularity is still very, very high. How do you explain that discrepancy? Because the heart of the matter of whether this turns into a dictatorship or not for the country of Mexico, and that's our neighbor, we need to get along with them. We want them to be as healthy as possible because that makes our country better too. And it sure, at least at the very least, doesn't make more problems for us. Isn't that discrepancy kind of the heart of the matter of whether this is going to go dictatorship or not? And what do we do about it with that discrepancy of they're apathetic to vote, but they're still pretty popular for a guy who's clearly trending in an authoritative direction?
So there's the topic of his approval ratings. It was Wittgenstein, the philosopher, who said that truth is independent from perception. And the only truth here is that no dictatorship is good. Go to the Dominican Republic, or back then, for example, when Trujillo, the dictator who committed heinous crimes against his own people, was murdered, people suffered. Go to Chile, when Pinochet did a referendum on whether the people wanted or did not want for him to remain in power in the yes or no referendum, lots of people voted for him. Go to Argentina, you'll see the influence of Videla. Paraguay, the influence of Stroessner. So this Venezuela, Hugo Chavez is still a popular figure. So no dictatorship is good. And I've mentioned it before. It has been a fad or a tradition between Latin American countries to vote against their own interests, which are the the democratic interests. But if we were to be like doctors, for example, and do a surgery and analyze the root problem, what would we see? That people are tired of corruption, they are tired of violence, they're tired of being lied to. And the result is that they vote for authoritarian figures who, at the end of the day, are much worse than the leaders who are elected democratically and leave power democratically and don't mess with the separation of powers.
Gabriel Salazar saying it's a universal thing that if you've got a country that's having economic and corruption problems, more freedom will cure those problems. Less freedom will perpetuate those problems. We'll keep an eye on our friends to the south in Mexico and the other countries in Latin and South America that perpetually have to struggle with this. Frankly, in America, we need to pay attention to it because we're not doing great on it on our own front in a couple of different ways. Gabriel Salazar saying outstanding stuff today. Really appreciate your time. We're going to have you back on. But until we get you back on, let folks know where you're writing, what you're working on, and what your social media is so they can follow you until we see you again on Heard Tell.
Right now I'm writing an article with the help of my friends over at Young Voices about the importance of liberalizing the economy and how that is in the interest of the poorer people, and the middle class and everyone really. And you can find my writings over at Twitter at Gabriel Sala Sing. So that's my name without the Salazar, just a Sala.
And his Twitter handle is on the screen graphic there if you're watching on the YouTube or the Facebook page. Make sure you give him a follow. We joke about me being the oldest of the Young Voices, which is true. I am the oldest. I think he's the youngest. I can't believe how articulate and insightful you are. You've got a great future ahead of you, my friend, and we're glad to get in on the ground floor of it. Can't wait to talk to you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd love to be here.
And I just got to mention again, we were talking about it before I brought you on. That picture is spectacular. That's your grandfather over your shoulder. That's not him in one of the old time photos that you get at the amusement park. That's what I thought it was when I first saw it. That's actually his grandfather. That's spitting image. Good looking family.
My grandfather and my beautiful mom, my beautiful grandma, and my grandfather, who was an admirable man, the man I look up to the most.
Yeah, my paternal grandfather, just a titan of a guy. I want to do a show. We should just do a show on our grandfather sometime. We'll bring you back and do that as a special, maybe.
I'd love that.
I'd love it too, my friend. Family gets it done. Gabriel Salazar Singh, Young Voices contributor. Great job, buddy. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Welcome back to Heard Tell. We're just going to touch on this for a minute because I'm kind of tired of talking about this individual. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. Yes, she was on the witness stand in a trial. Now, here's what's going on with this. There is a movement by some political operatives to get a couple of people kicked off the ballots because of their involvement with the January 6th rioting. They have brought a case against Madison Cawthorn, and they've brought another case against Marjorie Taylor Greene, and they've threatened to do so in a couple other places. Now, the Madison Cawthorn one already got nixed by the judge. That ain't going to go forward. But the Marjorie Taylor Greene one, they let proceed, and she had to testify under oath. Now, this probably isn't going to go anywhere, and we'll detail why in just a second. But what was interesting was what she did not say on the stand. If you remember back during the steroid trials, Sammy Sosa famously in front of Congress all of a sudden forgot how to speak English, and other people had the classic, "I don't recall, Senator." Well, that's the route Marjorie Taylor Greene went. She didn't claim to forget how to speak English, at least, but she did say, "I don't recall," a whole bunch of stuff that we have her on the record recalling quite clearly when she isn't under oath and has very serious consequences if she was going to be caught lying. So I wrote about it in ordinary-times.com. You can look at it. I said, quoting myself here, "It never fails that the most bombastic blowhards change their tunes when there are real consequences to the words coming out of their mouths. The legal basis for this attempt to keep her off the ballot is very questionable, and the folks looking for a reckoning over January 6th are not going to find one here, if anywhere. What is apparent is what Marjorie Taylor Greene has told us through her actions and rhetoric all along. There's no there there. Her fire-breathing MAGA act is all pyrotechnics like a sparkler. and no actual ordinance to do anything other than spew sparks and the stench of sulfur for burn-up material that flashes brightly but has no substance to it. Oh, and there's one more twist to come in this political clown show, because yet another Georgia shambles back to the forefront. Whatever the judge decides here doesn't actually become a final thing. It goes to Brad Raffensperger. Yeah, you remember him from the Georgia mess and recall and all that. He's actually up with a challenger as well. So Brad Raffensperger, call your office. Again, in the end, this legal challenge will probably fail. Marjorie Taylor Greene will get to claim even more victimhood in the fundraising thereof. The electorate in her very red district will probably reelect her, and one of the most unfit members of Congress in recent memory will continue to be an embarrassment for the country. We get the government we deserve, but we should all loathe the voters of Georgia's 14th district for thinking Marjorie Taylor Greene should be anything more than the on-paper front woman for her family's businesses. Those voters deserve all the invective they get. More Heard Tell right after this.
Now let me see you go off like a bomb.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. One little final note here. We usually try to end on an uplifting note. We all miss Sean Connery. Loved all of his movies. Loved him as James Bond. Loved him in just about anything he did. Cool little story, though. His estate, his widow has been selling. He had an extensive art collection. And one of the prize pieces of that art collection was an actual Picasso. It's expected to raise almost 15 million pounds. That would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 to $27 million. Then auction it for the charity trust. It is hoping it will benefit one of his many charitable endeavors, but just a really cool incident. They're going to auction off his Picasso for the charities that were near and dear to him. A lot of money for one little painting. Then again, when Picasso does it, it's going to be worth a lot. So we miss Sean Connery, but he's still doing good work from his art collection. God bless them. That'll do it for Heard Tell. A lot of great guests this week. Very excited about it. Anxious to tell you, it's cool talking a little Mexican politics. We span the world here. We don't just talk about the things we want to talk about. We need to keep that wide perspective. We'll continue to do so. Appreciated our guest, Gabriel, being here for that. We'll talk to you again tomorrow morning. Remember, Good Talks, the interview-only segments come out every afternoon. You can find them on the YouTube channel and on all the podcasting platforms. Make sure you subscribe to all of those. The YouTube channel and podcasting platforms. That way you don't miss a single thing with Heard Tell. So until we see you again, wherever you are across the street around the world, we hope you and yours are well. We hope you are well fed. Can't wait to see you again on Heard Tell. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.
Somos la